we're now delivering one new major feature every 11 hours. That is where we're at.
Hi, Martin. Welcome to Drag and Drop.
Hi.
It's great to have you on. Thank you for, agreeing to be a guest and come and share a bit about, what you're seeing in this, world of technology that we're in at the moment.
Yeah. There's a lot going on right now.
Yes,
it's
definitely.
An ever-moving journey.
Yeah. And, it'd be good for, a little introduction to yourself for those, who don't know about you, a bit about your background and where you're currently working.
Sure. So I've essentially been in software delivery for a lot of years, more than 30 years at this point. In fact, I think I'm getting to the 35 years, which is really quite depressing. From, hands-on coding all the way through, running engineering teams and then, into DevOps, and which became platform engineering, so all the way kind of through that in various different industries and enterprises, etc., and some government work too. And then more recently, about almost 3 years ago now, I joined Harness as a field CTO there, where, focusing again on that software delivery side of things and working with customers to help them define their strategy and their implementations of how they deliver software safely, reliably, securely, all the things.
Yeah, sure. All the things everyone's thinking about at the moment, right?
Yeah.
And, like you said, you're coming up to nearly 35 years, so a long time, helping enterprises modernize, software delivery. So what problem do you think, AI has really exposed that most organizations weren't really prepared for?
I think it was a little bit of system shock. So suddenly they're generating tons more code but everything else was kind of built around, manual approvals, like manual testing. And if you're making, up to 10 times as much stuff, how do you make those teams scale? How do you make sure it releases? And I think that's been the thing, is that there's been this thing of, well, we're coding so much more stuff. Why aren't we getting more stuff out the door? Well, we're not getting the stuff out the door because all the other things, need AI applied to them, or, maybe some of those governance things that we do, maybe there's a better way to do those, and you see it now. We did a state of software engineering survey, and I think it was something like 22% of people who responded were saying that, since the implementation of AI, deployments ended back in a rollback or a hotfix or an incident, that's insane, because pre-AI, that would have been an incredibly high number, right? And it's difficult to apply all those things at the right speed.
Yeah, yeah. And in your role, you're traveling, customers, conferences, and everyone is talking about building AI agents, right? So very few are talking about deploying them safely and into production. So why is there such a big gap between building an agent and actually trusting it in an enterprise?
Yeah, that is an interesting thing, because, building an agent is like a demo problem. It's like, hey, look, I've built this thing and look how cool it is. Trusting it in production is more about, identity, permissions, guardrails, and evidence, right? That it's performing all those things. And I think the challenge is how do you, make sure that all the right guardrails are in place, make sure that it has the right access to the right things and can't do things it's not supposed to. And, we've seen things in the news that are scary, when the frontier models are essentially releasing out, agents are escaping from their test environments and hacking other companies and, all of that stuff that's been going on, those problems are still a problem in the enterprise, and I think, honestly, enterprises have kind of been stuck with three bad choices as they're building these agents, because they're kind of saying, well, we're either struggling to get them out because there's a human bottleneck, because we don't really know how to test them and how to monitor them, or, you're giving them like a huge broad access and then see previous comment.
Yeah.
Or, or just do nothing and let them go. And honestly, I've spoken to some organizations where I said, oh, how are you testing them? How are you validating that they're running in production correctly? And they're like, which is incredibly scary.
Yeah, definitely. And, obviously I've been looking at the things you speak about on LinkedIn as well. And you recently, you shared that, only around 8% of organizations have successfully deployed AI agents into production, so kind of, adding to what you just said, what's stopping the other 92%?
Honestly, it's the missing governance layer, right? Identity, policy enforcement, evidence that it's running correctly, all the things that kind of let leadership say, hey, it's doing all the right things. We can trust it. Again, going back to that trust, so that actually when those agents are running in a production environment where they can do scary things, and we've seen they can do scary things if you don't have those guardrails in place, so that essentially you can sleep at night, right? Because they're not going to do the scary thing. So I think that's the challenge. It's not like when you deploy a standard piece of software where you can have very deterministic testing, and that same testing and monitoring in the production environment is very easy to do with traditional software. When you have an agent, it's like, is it having hallucinations? Is it using the right model? Is it suddenly really expensive? Is it still giving the right answers? All of those things are now challenges that we didn't have before. And it's much harder to test because you can ask an agent the same question twice, and you can almost guarantee it's going to give you two different answers.
Yeah. That's true. And then many executives, they assume, AI adoption is simply choosing the right model. So from what you're seeing, what are the real enterprise bottlenecks that appear once companies try to actually scale with AI?
Yeah, choosing the model's the easy bit. That's like 10% of the decision. The real bottlenecks, honestly, they're building in all the things that I was just talking about. So testing throughput, making sure the right release governance is there, that you've got the right security triage, that the capacity is there, the cost accountability is there. It's really everything after you've built the agent that you need to make sure is scalable, that you know what an incident actually looks like. You know how you can roll back from the current version of the agent that you've deployed, or the model or the tool that you're using, right? And honestly, I think the reality is that, the governance and the guardrails, they shouldn't be bolt-ons that you add in after. They should be foundational to what you're building, right? We spent years building in guardrails for software development and everything else. Although a lot of the time those guardrails were on paper, which means they were more advice than guardrails. But I think having those things built in automatically into the way you build and deploy your agents, and including when you're running the agents, I think all of those things, is where the focus needs to be. Have I got the right governance in place for my agent? Okay, now I can make sure it's doing the right things because I put the governance in first, then the agent, not the agent, and try to bolt the governance on top.
Yeah. And, you've talked about, code is no longer the limiting factor, and if that's true, what becomes a competitive advantage over the next few years?
Yeah. Do you know what? That's a really interesting one, because I do think, I'm not saying code is free. It isn't free, but, the cost to create code has seriously reduced, right? And it is all those same things that happen afterwards, So, essentially everyone's going to have fast code, but not everyone is going to have a fast, safe delivery system. And that's the difference right now. I think like in the last couple of years, DORA reports, they've made reference to the fact that we're generating all this code, but the actual percentage of new features that get delivered is like tiny, is single digit, right? And
Wow.
I think the companies that are genuinely winning are the ones that have those scalable guardrails in place to be able to do all the other things. They're the ones that are gonna win, essentially. They're the ones that say, hey, I can trust all of these things that's been generated. I know my code is still secure. I know it's had all the testing that it needs. I know how it's running in production. I know how to monitor it. Those are the ones that are ultimately going to win. And I would loop back on that too, because there's also a really low kind of number of enterprises, and I can't remember the number off my head, who basically say, hey, I can show ROI. I can show ROI on my AI investment in terms of what it's delivering. That number's really, really small. But I think the ones that can do that are the same ones, the ones that have planned it, they have the right governance, and they can actually track it to a business outcome. Hey, I implemented this and I got 25% more sales. Awesome. That's a business outcome we can track to, because it's no good talking about, hey, we did more PRs or we did more we generated more lines of code or any of those don't mean anything to the business, right? The
Yeah.
businesses that we operate in care about, are we increasing customer engagement? Are we, are people using our service? Are they buying more things from our site? That's what they
Yeah.
care about.
And traditional software delivery already has, quite mature DevOps practices. So why do AI agents fundamentally change the software delivery lifecycle?
So I don't think they necessarily fundamentally change it. I genuinely feel like it's an evolution. I think that where it changes is, where the human is in the loop. And
Yeah.
one of the things that's great is DevOps enabled us to build these great deterministic automations, right? And I think there is a tendency for people to go, I can make AI do that. And it's like, why would you make AI? You already have a great automation here. What really separates those and the evolution really is using AI for its judgment. Right. So, hey, this is what's changed in the code base. I've had a look at that. I've had a look at everything that calls it. Let's only run these 50 unit tests instead of the 500 because those are the 50 that are impacted by the code change. And then suddenly your delivery is faster. Hey, I've seen that there's a new CVE in my code. I've got a new security vulnerability, but I can also see that it's not reachable. So I'm going to lower the priority from high to medium, and I can generate the PR to help you fix that. Or even at a runtime level, right? So once you're operating your software, you should be able to understand that a new 0-day vulnerability has popped up, and it should almost trigger 2 actions automatically. The AI should be saying, okay, how do I put some edge protection in at the right? So how do I shield myself to the right? And then on the left-hand side, okay, how do I remediate this? Which are the code bases I need to update? Where can I create those pull requests so we can deliver the fix? And while we're doing that, we're still protected.
And, one topic I'm hearing, more and more of is, AgentOps, right? How would you explain AgentOps to a CIO or CTO who already understands DevOps, but is trying to understand what's the difference?
Yes, the way I would frame it is I would say DevOps kind of really governs the code changes moving through the pipeline to deliver that software. I think AgentOps governs the decisions in an autonomous system makes. So you're combining the two together. So that's including decisions to change something through the same kind of life cycle: build, evaluate, deploy, run, feedback, start again. I think that's it. And I think, there is some new primitives in there. So things like agent identity or, like scoped permissions, like evaluating quality, and gating it before it gets promoted. And super important, I'm amazed I haven't mentioned this already, but having a full audit trail of what the agent did and why.
Yeah.
So ultimately, AgentOps is really DevOps for decisions instead of commits. I think that's the way I would phrase it.
Sure. And, you've said, governance needs to become proactive rather than reactive, right? So what does good AI governance actually look like without slowing down innovation?
So essentially, good governance is it's codified, it's automated, and it lives kind of in the pipeline, and it knows how to take action based on things. So, good governance is, hey, I don't know, it could be anything. For example, I don't want any new high or critical CVEs in any of my code commits. I'm only allowed to deploy to this environment. I'm only allowed to make changes to this infrastructure. But having that in place, having it codified and automated, then what that means is if it's embedded in the processes, so it's embedded in the platform, your developer platform, so that it's making all those checks and it's doing them automatically, what you're really doing is creating a permission structure. So you're saying, as long as you stick inside these guardrails, it's going to go super quickly from dev to production. You're only going to have a problem by exception. So, I've introduced a critical CVE. Okay, that's going to stop the process. But if you've done all that before you close merge the PR, and you've met all the other testing requirements, security requirements, and everything else, it should get there super quickly. So like having that all embedded, and I think that permission structure then, it enables humans and it enables agents too. Here's the permission structure I run in, and I genuinely think it's a true competitive advantage.
And, as AI agents, they become digital teammates rather than just tools. How should enterprises really think about their identity, permissions, and trust?
So this is an interesting one. I had a really long discussion months back now with Matthew Skelton, the guy who wrote Team Topologies. And we really got into this in terms of discussion because, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, it changes the dynamic. I was talking with a leader from an organization just a few days ago, and they were saying how they've changed the size of their teams now because, you know, they've gone to smaller teams with more agents. So they didn't change the overall number of people. They just changed the size of the teams to make that a more effective workflow. But one of the key things that I'm finding more and more is that I'm not saying treat agents as people because they're not, but treat them like you would an employee. Give them a permission structure that they're allowed to work with. Give them an escalation point so that, you know, alongside their tasks that they're completing, they know that if they go outside that permission, they can't go outside their permission structure. And if they think they need to, they know they need to raise their hand, right? So in the same way you'd onboard an employee, that's how you should onboard agents into your teams. Hey, what am I allowing this to do? What is it not allowed to do? And if it doesn't know, who does it raise its hand? Who does it send a notification to say, hey, I want to do this. Is that allowed?
Yeah. And you know, you're obviously, you know, in your role, you're speaking to numerous leaders, you know, about, you know, how things are going. And, you know, with security teams, you know, they're now worrying about, you know, prompt injection, tool misuse, and, you know, AI supply chain risk and identity. So which of these concerns, you know, in your conversations, do you feel enterprise leaders are still underestimating?
I think realistically, it's identity. I think, you know, all the way along, even with the early adoption of MCP and various other things, it's always been how do we do identity right? You know, everyone's watching the model, but, you know, kind of almost nobody's watching what credentials those agents are using. And it's a little frustrating because, you know, we do know how to do good credentials. We do know how to do least privilege and all of those things, you know, credentials for the task that it's performing. But there is, you know, if you give an agent some kind of global level permissions to something, it can actually be super damaging and do all sorts of things.
Yeah.
When it's trying to do the thing that you've asked it, but it doesn't necessarily do it the way that you think it's going to do it. You know, so for me, that's like the big one. That's the number one, I think. Yeah, definitely.
And, you know, adding on that, you know, like losing visibility, you know, into what AI is doing is actually, you know, a pain point for many and fear for many executives, right? So, you know, how important is that observability and auditability as AI agents, you know, become more autonomous?
I would say that if you have autonomy without any kind of observability, that isn't autonomy. That is genuinely a black box with a huge blast radius. Like that is, you know, I absolutely don't do that. And you know, I think that fear, that losing visibility fear, I think it's the right fear to have. It's not that the agent makes a bad call, because everybody can make a bad call, and agents, you know, they can make mistakes. I mean, most agents now, even if you're using chat, tell you, hey, I'm just an agent. I can make mistakes, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, it's making sure that the audit trails are there. So it's fine if it makes a bad call and you know why it made it and you can see when it made it, what the data it was making that decision on. So you can actually then remedy that, if that makes sense. But if you have no visibility of that, then, you know, there's no evidence trail, then I think you're lost, because how do you know what it did? How do you know it didn't open up a bunch of ports on your firewall so that anyone can get access to your environment? Like that audit trail piece is key. And it's audit trail with context. I think that is super important. I was doing this. This is why I was doing it.
Yeah. And, you know, you've spoken about in the past about, you know, moving from software pipelines to software delivery systems. You know, can you explain that shift and why it's becoming more important now in the AI era?
Yeah, I think it's that view that ultimately, you know, the software delivery becomes to a degree autonomous. And I think it's an evolution, right? I think we're getting close to having all the capabilities across the entire SDLC, where you can do everything from, you know, generating the code to the pull request, to the testing, to the resiliency testing, to the security checks, to deploying to multiple environments, doing all the approvals and everything out and getting it out to production. And doing that with a combination of deterministic and agentic flows that help you do that. But I also think it's a maturity curve, right? I think the technology will be there before the trust is there, right?
Mhm.
And which is absolutely right. That's absolutely how it should be, you know. And I think it's an evolution of, hey, I do everything deterministic. But I might use agents to create my workflows or create my
Mhm.
pipelines or create my tests. To, hey, actually, I have some agentic flows in there where it's actually making the decisions and it's partially autonomous, but there's still a human in the loop for key points, if that makes sense. And then I think the final stage is, hey, as long as it's within my permission structure, I can deploy it. I think it's an evolution, but I think it's the way it is. And what happens is, the way teams work is, especially if you're talking about platform engineering teams or
Yeah.
DevOps teams, they're evolving the way they work to facilitate and put the intent and the guardrails and the parameters in, for those agents that are doing those worker tasks for them. So they're not doing the, trawling through CVEs, for example, for security. What they're actually getting is intelligence out of it, and they're setting up what those parameters are, where the agent can act and where it can't.
And, based on all this conversation, and, you're meeting execs and leaders, regularly, where does Harness fit into solving these enterprise challenges? What are your customers or prospects trying to solve before they even start talking about features?
Yeah, and I will say, mostly when I talk to enterprises and customers or prospects, I'm very rarely talking about features, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. We're talking
Yeah.
about the capabilities they need to make something happen. And realistic, Harness, essentially, we do everything after code. So once that code is generated or created or written or combination of all of the above,
Hmm.
automate everything after that. We have a software delivery agent that looks after things like CI, CD, testing, things like that. We have a security testing agent to look at those things like, security testing, SAST and DAST scanning, things like generating S-bombs and kind of managing that supply chain. We also have like runtime security. So, what's happening when I've deployed this is my software running safely and securely? What happens when something becomes a vulnerability? How do I fix that? And then, finally, because certainly when I was running platform teams, this was definitely part of what I owned, managing the cost of all of that. So making sure that actually, how am I spending money on my agents? How am I spending money on my infrastructure? How long are my processes taking? Am I using the right models? Is it cost effective? Are my developers using their models correctly? When they're generating code, did they use a frontier model for doing a 3-line fix that they could have just written themselves? All of those things feed into that. So, when we say we do everything after code, I think some people look at us and go, no, you don't. But that is
Yeah.
genuinely where we're aiming. Do we have every single gap filled? Probably not. There's more than 30 processes that happen between code
Yeah.
and production. So,
Yeah.
but, that is definitely where we're aiming. It's why we're a leader, in Gartner for the DevSecOps platforms, for 2026. So is because that's exactly where we are. And it's where we continue to strive. We work with our customers really closely. And it's one of the joys of my job is being involved with the customer advisory board on a regular basis. I do love that, getting that feedback from the customers, getting that direct, hey, this is great, but this isn't working so well for us. So we can then go away and fix that. And let me tell you, we use all of our own software internally, as well as coding agents, etc. And Josie, our CEO, was talking the other day and saying, we're now delivering one new major feature every 11 hours. That is
Wow.
where we're at,
Wow.
which is insane when we think back to like where we were a year ago.
Yeah, wow.
That kind of velocity, and it's about making sure we're filling all those gaps and we're meeting our customers' needs and helping them solve the problems that they need to be solved.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, is there any use cases, that you can talk about where, like, or what's one, enterprise transformation, you've seen and it's made you think, this is what AI delivery should look like in the next 3 to 5 years?
So that's an interesting one, because I would say in some ways is difficult to imagine 3 to 5 months sometimes.
True. That is true. That is true.
We certainly have some very large financial institution customers who, who have really taken this journey of software delivery like as an evolution process, and I can remember, and bear in mind, I think things have moved on massively in the last 6 months, but even 6 months ago, they were saying, hey, can we use your agents to do this in our workflow to help us reduce this problem? Can we use them here to help reduce the onboarding time? Can we use them here? So they were proactively working with us to find use cases where those agents could actually take away toil, take away those terrible jobs that nobody really likes to do, and feed them into their pipeline. What I love about that is it's a continuous evolution to that full autonomy, right? That thing of building out their overall internal developer platform so that it, from code to production is a known path. It does all of the right things. It tests the right things. It makes the right decisions, and it puts its hand up, when there's anything that falls outside of that. I think that's the goal. I think we certainly have customers who are way on their way to that journey, and they're going on that journey with us, if that makes sense. So it's exciting. I think we'll get to that autonomous flow at some point. Like I say, I think we're pretty much there in terms of making sure we have all the tools and guardrails in place. But I think, there also is a trust layer to that, and we have to build the trust. Just like, 15 years ago when you were building out those early CI/CD pipelines in whatever it was, Jenkins or something. And, did you trust it the first time you did it? Absolutely not. You had somebody who was sitting there saying, yes, that's okay. Yes, that's okay. And then sitting and watching it after the deployment to say, yeah, no, it looks okay still. I'm happy with that, to the point where they gain trust, and that kind of evolution started. I don't think it's any different with AI.
Yeah. And, looking ahead, what capabilities do you think, every enterprise engineering organization will need if they really want to successfully operate AI at scale?
I would say there's probably 3 things. I think they will need like a really strong agent identity and permission layer in the same way that we have like, single sign-on and RBAC for humans today. I think they will need an equivalent for agent identity and the permissions and governance piece. I think probably another big one is that kind of evaluation and quality gathering type stuff for agents. So actually being able to evaluate and test agents and understand that and be able to do that in pre-production and in production. So before you deploy it, what it's going to do, how it's going to work, how it works with the models that it's attached to. It's got all those test gates, and I feel like that's an evolving area right now. But I think going forwards, that's going to be table stakes. And I think the last one is that kind of full life cycle observability, which we touched on before. But a true evidence trail for every agent action, just like we have now for every human action, especially if you live in a regulated environment, right? If you're in a bank or healthcare or insurance or actually almost anything these days, you're going to have regulatory requirements. Having all those, everything audited with the who, the what, the why, the when, it is key to actually having those, it's table stakes. Like I say, those are the 3 I think you have to have.
Yeah. Yeah. And, finally, for you personally, what are you kind of, as, you've been in this industry for such a long time and things are moving at a rapid pace. What are you kind of most looking forward to, or, looking forward to the direction things are moving?
I think for me, that's a really interesting question. And I think for me, it's, I've always said that living in the software development world, you're constantly learning, you're constantly having to evolve. In my career, I probably coded in like 10 to 15 different coding languages from, going back to C, C++ and assembler, all the way through to things like Go and Node.js and 100 things in between, it feels like. I think what is exciting is what's to come, in terms of, do we make vibe coding really work? Can you actually get to that point where you can deliver vibe coding applications in a safe, secure way with all the right governance and the maintenance on top of it? I also think just the expansion of what is going to be delivered. So this sounds weird because it's like me saying, I'm looking forward to the thing I don't know. But like that is what's exciting, right?
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the fact that the next thing that comes around the corner is going to make me go, wow. I love
Yeah.
it when I see a piece of technology and I'm like, okay, that
Yeah.
is just
Yeah.
so like, that is just so cool. And sometimes weirdly, it's the little things that, that make it feel amazing. I'll give you a really quick example. Years ago, I kept my phone. I won't say which vendor, but I'd kept my phone for about 3 or 4 years, and
Yeah.
I kept looking at the new one saying, hasn't changed that much. I won't but eventually I'm like, no, I'm going to upgrade my phone. So I upgraded
Yeah.
my phone. What was really interesting is there was no one big wow, right? There was no one big wow when I got the new phone. What there was 100 really small incremental changes that made that phone feel like it was fabulous. Like
Yeah.
it was like, this is so much better. And they were all little tiny things, right? And I
Yeah.
think, we've sort of got used to this. There's all these big things happening,
Yeah.
with the way we're using AI, the use of agents and all that reasoning. But I often think it's all the little nuances that it's also introducing at the same time. And that's happening because of the rate of change, because of the velocity, because of, so I'm excited for that. That's what I'm looking forward to. The big wow
Yeah.
moment, another
Yeah.
wow. And then after that one, I want another one after that. Right.
Yeah.
A new thing for me to learn and expand on.
Yeah, of course. Amazing. Well, I appreciate you speaking to me, Martin, and, sharing, everything, you're speaking to, execs on a regular basis. So it's good to share, what you're hearing. And, it'd be great to maybe speak again in the future as, these wow
Sure.
moments appear, or, like you said, 3 to 5 months, things change rapidly, right? So we could have a whole
Yeah.
different
Literally.
conversation in a couple of months' time. So let's keep in touch and hopefully speak again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
A pleasure. Thanks, Martin.